Hey everybody, welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching Cicero's Finest Hour by Historia Civilis. So, last time we really brought Caesar's story to an end. We saw his funeral. Now we are truly moving past Caesar. We're going into a new era of Roman politics, and we've already been introduced to many of the characters who will saturate this era of Roman history. So, last time we started off right after the murder of Caesar, and initially it looked like the conspirators might get away with it. They had made some deals with Caesar's remaining men, most notably Caesar's right-hand man, Mark Antony. It seemed like Antony was willing to negotiate, but as time went on, as we got further away from the assassination, the public got angrier and angrier with the conspirators. It seems that despite everything, despite all of Caesar's authoritarian behavior, he was still pretty popular, or at least his policies were pretty popular with the Roman people. And so we ended up last time with the crowd getting riled up at Caesar's funeral. Mark Antony was a participant, and the conspirators are now in great danger. Many of them are trying to leave Rome for their own safety. So Caesar is gone, but the Republic has certainly not been restored to its former health. I'm curious to see where we go from here. This one's going to be all about Cicero, at least according to the title. I'm sure this will be a good one. If you guys end up enjoying this episode, I'd appreciate it if you would check out the Patreon, which is linked in the description, or channel memberships, both of which give you access to exclusive content, including Historia Civilis reactions. Anyway, with all of that out of the way, let's jump right into this reaction.
It took about 10 days for Octavius to learn of his great-uncle Caesar's death. In those 10 days, the world had changed. Caesar had been laid to rest in a fiery funeral. Riots had erupted on the streets of Rome, and the contents of Caesar's will had been revealed to the public. But Octavius didn't know any of this.
And as we remember, the reason we have a little bit of irony here, Octavius is far away, he doesn't know what's going on, but he has basically been named the main inheritor of Caesar's legacy. Beforehand, it was Mark Antony. Mark Antony was Caesar's right-hand man. Everyone thought Caesar would select Antony to be the practical and symbolic inheritor of his legacy, his political mission. But instead, Caesar sort of wanted to keep it more in the family, and he selected Octavius.
All he knew was that Caesar was dead. Octavius was in Illyricum, overseeing preparations for Caesar's eastern campaigns. Those campaigns were probably off now, but what did that mean? The people around Octavius advised him to take up the nearby legions and avenge his great-uncle's death. But
Octavius is in a really difficult position politically. Caesar has just been murdered, and Rome has sort of been thrown into chaos. There was initially some sort of truce, negotiations between, I guess what we could call the Caesarians, like Mark Antony and Lepidus, and the conspirators, though it's kind of a free-for-all at this point. And Octavius isn't there to participate, so he has to observe the political situation, which hasn't erupted into complete violence, but is teetering on the edge, and he has to work out what exactly he's going to do.
Octavius hesitated. He didn't know what the political situation was like back in Rome. If he started moving legions around, he ran the risk of being declared an enemy of the people by the Senate.
Yeah, not to mention, and this is probably less important than the political considerations, but Octavius has never really been that much of a military man. He's always been more talented on the political side of things. That is where his skill set lies.
Octavius decided to return to Rome as a private citizen. This was perhaps risky, but he didn't see a better option. Once he properly understood the political situation, he could decide what to do next. On the road to Rome, he began receiving a flood of letters. Caesar's will had been opened. Octavius was pretty much the last person to learn that he had been named Caesar's heir, giving him the rights to most of Caesar's Scrooge McDuck-sized fortune. As an expression of this passing of the torch, Caesar posthumously adopted Octavius as his son.
Yep.
When he got the news, we are told that Octavius broke down and cried. Octavius's mother wrote him a letter advising him to return to Rome immediately, but to take the side roads, hide his identity, and be on the lookout for assassins. His stepfather separately advised him to renounce his adoption, take the money, and to retire from public life as a monstrously wealthy man.
Yeah, he'll get a lot of this advice from his mother or other family members to basically take a step back, be cautious, because what Caesar has done is basically thrust Octavius into a very dangerous political situation. And, Caesar couldn't handle it. He was killed. He got murdered. So it takes someone extremely talented to step into Caesar's shoes and adequately fill them. Clearly, Caesar saw something in Octavius, but at this point, he's still relatively inexperienced. He doesn't have the accomplishments that he's going to rack up in the future. So, it's not unreasonable for his parents or other people around him to say, hey, maybe you should stay out of this one. This is an incredibly dangerous situation that takes such a level of skill that even Caesar himself couldn't handle it.
With a lot of conflicting advice coming his way, Octavius came up with his own plan. He would accept the adoption. From this moment forward, he would go by the name of Gaius Julius Caesar, the same as his adoptive father. This is hella confusing, and so historians have, over the years, decided to assign this new Caesar with the name Octavianus, or Octavian for short.
Octavian, and that's what we call him because we see a lot of emperors and people in this line taking the name Gaius Julius Caesar, but it would be really confusing if we called everybody Gaius Julius Caesar. Or maybe we would have to adopt what we do for some medieval European monarchs, where we have, Louis I, Louis II, Louis III. We could do it where we have, Julius I, Julius II, Julius III, but instead what we do is we refer to Octavius, we call him Octavian, and then when he becomes emperor, he's Augustus. So 3 different names, which isn't what he was called at the time. That's still pretty confusing, but that's the nomenclature we've decided to use.
Which is just the past tense version of the name Octavius. But it's important to remember that this is solely a convention among historians, and that, as far as his contemporaries were concerned, he was a second Caesar.
Yeah, and I don't think it's wrong to use a different name than they did at the time, but it does create a bit of a barrier where whenever we're talking about Octavian, we always have to remember that is not what the people who knew him or his contemporaries called him. He was, for all intents and purposes, named Gaius Julius Caesar, and all the weight that came along with that name. So that is something we have to keep in mind with our naming system.
When Octavian landed in Italy, he appeared in public under his new name. The crowds hailed him as his father's son. The Senate and the people were put on notice. The heir to Caesar was returning to Rome.
And I'm, curious to see how this plays out because, you can already see the makings of a power struggle. As I said, before Octavius, now Octavian, was named as Caesar's heir and was posthumously adopted, everyone thought that Mark Antony was going to get the honor. It's been given to Octavian, but Mark Antony, and Lepidus, of course, still hold a lot of the practical power in this situation. So you can kind of already see we're going to have a tricky situation.
Back in the capital, things were moving quickly. Antony and Lepidus had already pressured many of Caesar's assassins into leaving the city, which was good for them, but now they needed to look inward. If the Caesarian faction was to survive, the Antony-Lepidus alliance had to remain strong. As a first step, Antony's daughter was engaged to marry Lepidus' son, both of whom were children. This was a good start, but it was all symbolic. What else could they do?
So as we can see, and I mentioned this several episodes ago, and I've been repeating it for several episodes. As we talked about when the conspirators were planning on how to assassinate Caesar, there was a question about, well, do we just kill Caesar, or do we purge all the Caesarians? Now, they decided, at the urging of Brutus, to just murder Caesar and leave the other Caesarians, even the really powerful Caesarians like Antony and Lepidus. Now, if their goal was to return to the old days of the Republic and, wipe the Republic of this authoritarianism, I think they made a big mistake. Caesar was, of course, the most important guy in this equation, but with Caesar gone, there's other people who want to step up and fill that role, Mark Antony being the most obvious. And as we can see, now that Caesar's gone, Mark Antony and Lepidus are trying to reestablish Caesarian power, though I am unsure of how well they can work together. I mean, Mark Antony has quite the ego on him. He struggles to be a team player sometimes, but if they both know it's in their mutual interest to work together, then that's what they're going to do, and that is what they're doing. And as we've seen, the conspirators are sort of paying for their decision to just target Caesar. As Historia Civilis mentioned, a lot of them have been pushed out of Rome already.
There was the matter of the Pontifex Maximus. The position of Rome's chief priest was a lifetime appointment, previously held by Caesar. But here's the thing. Sometime within the last year or so, the Senate passed some minor piece of legislation that said that Caesar's son would succeed him as Pontifex Maximus, Octavian. This was a problem. Antony did some quick thinking and argued that since Octavian hadn't physically come to Rome and made his adoption official yet, legally speaking, Caesar had no son, at least for the next few days.
Yeah, okay.
Antony hastily called an election and made sure that his partner Lepidus took Caesar's place as Pontifex Maximus.
I mean, look, Roman law is not a very stable thing at this point. It's been broken 100 different times in 100 different ways. So, as always, those in power are bending the law to fit their whims. Whether or not Antony's objection was legitimate, of course, he doesn't actually care about enforcing the Roman legal system. He just wants to secure his and Lepidus's power.
The fact that it was Lepidus and not Antony offers us an insight that maybe Antony considered himself a junior partner in this alliance.
Interesting.
The riots and the...
That is interesting, because Mark Antony was considered Caesar's right-hand man. Not to mention, as I mentioned, Antony does have a bit of an ego. But, I think Lepidus is probably the more intelligent and level-headed partner of the two. Maybe he managed to get a bit of leverage over Antony. So maybe that's why he could have potentially been considered the senior partner in the relationship. Of course, this is all sort of speculation.
Killing and the political uncertainty had everybody on edge. Violent mobs were sometimes known to target specific politicians or threaten to burn down the entire city. There were already whispers of another civil war. Shops closed, foot traffic dried up, and a vast number of Romans went into hiding. The senator Cicero observed that, quote, even the mice are leaving. Many of Cicero's political allies had already fled the city and urged him to do the same. Cicero agonized over this decision, seeking advice from many of his friends abroad.
Cicero's got another important decision to make. I mean, he already had to make sort of a similar decision back in the days of Caesar and Pompey. What was Cicero going to do? Would he side with Caesar? Would he side with Pompey? Would he stay in Rome? Would he stay neutral? In that situation, he, I think, wanted to be neutral, but he decided it was in the best interest of the Senate and himself to side with Pompey and leave the city, though he always sort of played the middle route. He never wanted to alienate himself from Caesar or the Caesarian cause. So now Cicero has another decision to make. What does he do? Does he stay in Rome and try to establish an independent base of power? Does he try to fight as a voice of the Senate? Does he flee? Is it too dangerous to stay? Cicero is a talented guy. He's an intelligent guy. And he's one of the few political figures right now outside of the Caesarian and conspirator camps that has an independent base of support and power. due to how popular he is, how famous he is, his legacy. So he's got a choice.
In the end, he decided to stay in Rome and put his own life at risk so that he could fight in the Senate to avert another civil war. Friendly neighborhood historian Tom Holland calls this the most courageous decision of his life.
Could be.
By April, Octavian arrived in Rome. The Antony-Lepidus alliance had a legitimate claim to the leadership of the Caesarian faction, but so did Octavian. They immediately began butting heads.
I mean, this is sort of a classic situation where you have one guy in charge, Caesar, and he dies. Now you have a power struggle between whoever your guy in charge selected to rule, Octavian, and who actually holds the power at the moment, Antony and Lepidus. This is something we see many, many times throughout history, and we're seeing it play out right now.
Cicero writes that Antony started producing old decrees from Caesar that happened to back up whatever he was pushing at the moment. Cicero suspected that they were all forgeries, but he couldn't prove it. He also noticed that Antony was really dragging his feet when it came to handing over Caesar's fortune. It was Octavian's job, as Caesar's primary heir, to fulfill the terms of Caesar's will, which included the approximately 3 months' wages promised to every adult male Roman citizen. So long as Antony controlled Caesar's money, Octavian couldn't do this. So instead, he ignored Antony. He made the rounds to many of Caesar's old allies, asking for favors and taking out personal loans.
I think this is a very smart decision, frankly. I mean, clearly Antony has leverage over Octavian, and Octavian knows that very well. And so what Octavian is doing is trying to build his support separate from that. Try to get himself some power and some leverage. Pretty intelligent. Like I said, what we're going to see, I suspect, over these next couple of episodes is that Octavian is a savvy political operator. Now, regardless of what you think of Octavian, some people like him, some people do not like him. And regardless what you think of, him as emperor, because there's that whole period of his life as Augustus, we're not even getting into that. What we will see, despite all of his faults, is that, like I said, he is politically intelligent.
He couldn't raise the total amount this way, but he raised enough to get the ball rolling. People began receiving their money. But the most important aspect of this is that he let the public know that he was putting his own credibility on the line so that he could fulfill Caesar's commitment to the people. This made him wildly popular.
I mean, what Octavian has done is he's taken this act from Caesar, giving out money to Roman citizens, which was incredibly popular, that Antony is trying to block him from doing. And so he's doing it himself. He's basically co-opted it, and now he can say, I'm doing this on my own dime. And now that act from Caesar that was incredibly popular is now Octavian being incredibly popular. Smart.
Virtually overnight. If Antony's goal in dragging his feet was to damage Octavian's reputation, his plan backfired badly. He would eventually release Caesar's fortune, making Octavian one of the richest people on Earth.
And I think we're already getting a look at the fact that Octavian is suited for the job. I mean, I talked about earlier how it takes an extremely talented individual to fill Caesar's shoes, and especially to do something that even Caesar couldn't do. A less talented individual maybe wouldn't have known what to do with Antony holding Caesar's inheritance back. Maybe they would have gone crawling to Antony, tried to negotiate with him, and maybe that could have worked, but Octavian's showing that he's sort of a step above. He knows what he's doing.
By the summer of the year 44, Roman politics had completely realigned. Antony was still technically running things as consul, but Cicero was now the leader of a vocal anti-Antonian faction in the Senate. As Antony attempted to assert his dominance, Cicero fought him tooth and nail. The big debate over the summer was over what to do with the province of Cisalpine Gaul. Next year, Antony was due to take over as the governor of Macedonia. This was a great province. It came with 6 legions attached to it, but it wasn't the best province. The best province, given Rome's recent history, was Cisalpine Gaul. It came with a couple legions, a vibrant tax base, and most importantly, it was close to Rome.
Exactly. underline the most importantly. That's why it's so much better than any province, particularly for someone in a position like Antony. Regardless of the number of troops you have, the amount of taxes you can harvest, the best part is that you are a hop and a skip away from Rome itself. So it's pretty easy for you to mobilize an army and march down to Rome to get, whatever you want, right? Everyone knows this. That's probably one of the reasons why Cicero does not want Antony in that position. He's probably one of the worst people you could have in that position.
The threat of crossing the Rubicon was everything now. Whoever was the governor of Cisalpine Gaul had the opportunity to dominate Roman politics from a distance. But here's the thing. Decimus, one of Caesar's assassins, was going to be the governor of Cisalpine Gaul.
Yeah.
In fact, he'd been handpicked for this job by Caesar shortly before his death. But Antony didn't care about that. He wanted Decimus gone. He wanted that province. He proposed a swap in the Senate, Macedonia for Cisalpine Gaul. But he had some conditions. First, Antony wanted to bring over the 6 legions from Macedonia and keep the 2 in Cisalpine Gaul.
Yeah, this is a very Antony way of doing things. He's not satisfied with just a swap, which he should be satisfied with, frankly, because it gets him what he wants, which is the positioning that Cisalpine Gaul gives him. He needs a little bit more. He also wants to take all those legions with him. Like, come on, man. Antony loves to negotiate like this, which isn't really negotiating. He's just trying to strong-arm his opponent into getting what he wants. I think what we've seen is that in terms of the Caesarian faction, Lepidus has always had a little more tact. He's willing to negotiate a little more smartly. But, of course, the thing is, we are in an era which is very close to tipping over into violence. So, hey, maybe Antony's strategy of just pushing, threatening violence, basically, there's always an underlying threat, and if stuff doesn't go his way, just using force to get it, that might be the way to do things now.
Giving him a massive army. Second, he wanted his brother, Gaius Antonius, to take his place as the governor of Macedonia, leaving Decimus with just his toga in his hands.
Of course.
It's pretty clear what was going on here. It's exactly the kind of thing that Cicero feared.
Yeah.
Antony wanted to be another Caesar, another civil war. Cicero fought this request in the Senate, but people were exhausted, and nobody was prepared to go nuclear over a request to transfer provinces. He lost. The Senate sided with Antony.
Damn.
But Decimus didn't take this lying down. He said that Caesar had personally handpicked him as governor, and
Decimus is fighting back. Understandably, he is one of the conspirators. I was going to say, even after the assassination of Caesar, which was done by a bunch of senators, the entire Senate is still limp and is just not willing to fight for itself. I mean, the Senate is sure always fighting to a certain extent to keep its power and its privileges, but it's just really not willing to put up that much of a fight. Apart from, some of the conspirators like Decimus, or some of the rare few senators with a backbone like Cicero. I have a lot of criticism for the Roman Senate, which you'll know if you've watched a lot of these videos, and my criticism will continue.
And he seemed to remember the Senate passing a resolution saying that all of Caesar's legislation and appointments were locked in place. Was Antony interested in tearing up that agreement? Because that would open a whole can of worms.
It's also, just a quick note, very funny that one of the guys who murdered Caesar is now arguing that, well, do you want to start repealing Caesar's policy? I can't believe you would do that to him. It's like, you murdered the guy. Obviously, I understand politically why this is happening, but it's a bit funny.
As an act of defiance, Decimus took his legions and marched on some Gallic tribes in the Alps, winning a minor victory. The legions hailed him as imperator. He wrote to Cicero, asking if there was enough support in the Senate to get him a triumph for his victory. Some people just don't have an instinct for politics because there definitely wasn't. The Senate had just voted to take away his province.
Well, we've seen from these last couple of episodes that Decimus is extremely blunt. He clearly doesn't have much of an instinct for politics. He did a pretty good job making himself pretty damn unpopular during and after the assassination of Caesar. So if we're looking for a political genius, Decimus is not the conspirator you would turn to. You'd probably go more towards Brutus.
But Cicero told a polite lie and said he'd look into it. So the Senate under Antony had voted to take away Decimus's province. Decimus responded by saying that they didn't have that authority. Things were at a bit of a standoff. In June, all of the major anti-Antonians got together in central Italy for a big important meeting. The following people were in attendance.
Okay.
Cicero, Brutus, Brutus's wife Portia, Brutus's mother Servilia, Cassius, Cassius's wife Tertulla, and a conservative senator named Favonius.
Oh, the whole
Decimus
gang.
would have been invited, but he was obviously busy.
Yeah.
Cassius and his wife Tertulla were running late, so the meeting got started without them. Together, they considered an offer from the Senate that would put Brutus and Cassius in charge of grain collection in the provinces of Sicily and Asia Minor. This was basically a way to give Brutus and Cassius an excuse to stay away from Rome for the next couple years. Cicero told Brutus that they should take the offer. If they were going to continue avoiding Rome, they might as well make themselves useful. He could hold things down in the Senate.
And this is, it's quite the gamble, to be honest. And in retrospect, I guess it looks pretty unrealistic because we know that there's going to be violence and civil war breaking out. But, I don't think it's completely unimaginable at this time to think, well, the best we can hope to do is sort of wait out the storm. Send guys like Cassius and Brutus, these conspirators who are right now pretty unpopular with the Roman public, and of course with the remaining Caesarians, send them away from Rome, let them lie low for a couple of years. Hopefully things will be forgotten, and hopefully Cicero and the Senate can hold their own against Antony, either sort of becoming supreme, or at the very least staying equal. A very delicate balancing act over a course of several years, and of course that is not how it's going to go, really. Things will get very complicated. But, I think it makes sense that your head would be in that place.
Brutus was indecisive. He told Cicero that it was always his plan to return to Rome as soon as possible. Cicero responded by saying that it was not safe for Caesar's assassins to show their faces in the city. He told Brutus that his survival was paramount, since he, as the leader of the assassins, was the Republic's only defense against tyranny.
Jeez.
This was blatant flattery, and who knows if Cicero even meant a word of it. But
I was gonna say, really? I don't believe that. I don't think Cicero believes that. And there you go. Cicero knows what to do, though, so you gotta sort of flatter Brutus when you're telling him to get the hell out of here. He's not the savior of the Republic, but he is at the very least a counterweight against Antony.
But it seemed to be effective on Brutus. Cassius and his wife then rolled in there like a couple of tornadoes. Cassius got right to the point. Supervising grain collection is a slap in the face.
Okay,
He then
dude.
launched into a litany of all of their squandered opportunities since the assassination. And in particular, he criticized Decimus for not being aggressive enough in Cisalpine Gaul. Cassius informed the group that he would be turning down.
Not aggressive enough. Okay, I don't know about that. It's a slap in the face, sure, but it's fine to complain. That's what Cassius is doing. He's complaining. And there are a lot of missteps and a lot of missed opportunities. But at this point, Cassius, this is the situation you're in. So you have to deal with the cards that you have, right? At the moment. So I don't know.
Down the grain collection job. Instead, he would be heading to the province of Syria, where he was supposed to take over as governor next year. If the Senate wanted to take his province away, let him try. Brutus was like, fine. If Cassius was doing that, he would head to Asia Minor to help out another prominent conspirator, Trebonius. Brutus's mother Servilia spoke up and said that if that was their decision, she would persuade some friendly senators to get the offer rescinded.
You can already see what's happening. Cicero wants them to all sort of lay low for a couple of years, and hopefully he can establish some sense of normalcy in Rome. what's happening is they're all retreating to their independent power bases, some of them, like Decimus and Cassius, with pretty important positions of power. And what they're going to do is build up support, and the tension will continue to rise, and we're headed right for another civil war. Clearly, Cicero can see that. I'm sure a lot of people can see that. But, I mean, someone like Cassius doesn't want to accept the laying low situation, you know? That's not what he agreed to when he assassinated Caesar. He wanted more than that. And, you know, he wants to take what he's owed, or at least that's how he feels. Not to mention, I'm sure he feels he has a righteous cause. So Cicero is trying to prevent another civil war and struggling at the moment.
With their decision made, Cassius continued to hammer away at the absent Decimus for letting Antony get the better of him. Cicero tried to calm things down, telling everybody that it was useless to dwell on the past. He then began to, with no self-awareness, point fingers at everybody else in the room, asking each of them why they were not more decisive in the days following the Ides of March. Why on earth did they barricade themselves on the Capitoline Hill?
Okay, now I gotta turn it on Cicero. I agree, there's not much point looking at the past and throwing blame, but now that's exactly what you're doing. If you want to get all these people on your side, probably not a good idea. I mean, I agree. If you're a believer in the cause of the conspirators, then you would have wanted them to be more aggressive. I think, frankly, they should have purged a lot more Caesarians. They should have directly seized power, but they didn't, and it's over, and you can't really change that now.
And hand the initiative to Antony. What was the purpose of that? Servilia cut him off and shut down the debate. Nobody was really happy, but at least now they had a plan. Cicero would continue to work the Senate in Rome. Brutus would head to Asia Minor, and Cassius would head to Syria. From these powerful positions, they would have the strength to support Decimus against Antony.
Yeah.
In the days following the meeting, Cicero privately railed against his allies for being completely useless ever since the Ides of March. He wrote in one letter that, quote, "In good truth, I found a ship with timbers all gone to pieces. No plan, no system, no method."
Okay, I will say, I like Cicero. I think he's a really interesting and influential figure, but he can be really sanctimonious at times, and a hypocrite as well. He is very critical of all of those around him, when perhaps some self-reflection would be a little more helpful. But when you've got important characters like this, a lot of them have quite the ego. Self-reflection is not sort of top of their priority list. So, Cicero's kind of a funny guy.
By the autumn of 44 BCE, Cicero had switched to a much more aggressive posture. He made a series of speeches and distributed a series of pamphlets that directly denounced Antony as a tyrant. These are known as the Thephilippics, and they survive to this day. Another one of Cicero's political innovations was that he began to publicly praise Octavian. If he could split the Caesarian faction between Antony and Octavian, he might be able to oust Antony in a moment of weakness.
Yeah, now what we're seeing, this is truly evidence that we are moving past Caesar. His influence is still everywhere, but in some ways we are moving beyond it, in that we now have an Antonian faction and a pro-Octavian faction, or at least Cicero is trying to develop that. Now, the long-term consequences could be bad, but all he's trying to do right now is to lessen the power that Antony has.
Octavian welcomed the support of Cicero and used the opportunity to ramp up his own criticism of Antony. Over this period, Cicero and Octavian got really close.
They've got shared interests, which is taking down Antony. Octavian wants to take down Antony because he, probably rightfully, believes himself the true inheritor of Caesar's political legacy. That's what Caesar believed. And, Cicero also wants to take down Antony to prevent tyranny, to bolster the Republic, whatever. So they have shared interests. Now, with partners, particularly in a situation like this, as we know, their interests are going to diverge eventually. And that's when some trouble will emerge. But at the moment, they have the same goals, basically.
Octavian began calling the older man father as a sign of respect.
Wow.
The opportunity to split the Caesarian faction came sooner than anybody expected. In October of 44, when Antony left Rome to inspect some legions, Octavian used his newfound wealth to raise a private army and march on Rome. It wasn't a very big army, only 3,000 retired soldiers, but it was enough to occupy the city. Just like that, a civil war had begun. It was incredibly sudden, and...
Yeah, what is going on? That came absolutely out of nowhere. I'm very curious to hear the context.
Strange. Nobody had bothered to make any official declarations or anything. It just happened. Antony approached from the south with those legions he was inspecting. 6 in total. 30,000 soldiers if they were at full strength. By November, Octavian had abandoned Rome and fled north, and Antony had reoccupied the capital. But Octavian quickly learned that 2 of those 6 legions under Antony were unhappy to be marching against the son of Caesar. At their first opportunity, they abandoned Antony and came over to Octavian's side.
Okay, I'm going to need a little more context, and maybe some of you know, or maybe it's been lost to the histories, but what exactly was that sudden march on Rome about? Was there a particular reason, or did Octavian just see his chance and took it? I'm not quite sure.
Antony's first instinct was to have Octavian declared an enemy of the people, but with several of his legions defecting and Cicero leading a vocal anti-Antonian faction in the Senate.
Of course, this is an example of when Cicero is more about practicality than principle. And I think that's completely fine. I mean, I agree with that approach. You have to be willing to get stuff done. You have to be practical over 100% adherence to your political principles. Cato was someone who was 100% adherent to his political principles, and he, frankly, was a bad influence on Rome. As we can see, Cicero is basically taking Octavian's side over Antony's side, even though Octavian was the one who marched on the city. Very clearly a tyrannical move, something that Cicero very much opposes, and yet, because it's in his interest, he is still opposing Antony in this measure.
He wasn't sure if such a thing would pass. Both sides now appealed to Decimus for support. With his 2 legions, he could easily tip the balance in either direction.
Yeah.
But there was never any doubt. Decimus sided with Octavian.
Of course.
Cicero ramped up his attacks in the Senate. All of the pieces were falling into place. But Antony surprised everybody. He marched north around Octavian's legions and headed straight for Decimus in Cisalpine Gaul.
Smart.
Antony's legions outnumbered Decimus's by 2 to 1, but honestly half of those under Decimus were straight up rookies. So really...
And I'll give Antony something. I've also been very critical of Antony, but we've seen Antony does certainly have talent militarily. I think he struggles politically, to be honest, but he does have military talent, just in the same way that, sort of on the flip side, Octavian is very talented politically, but he's a little less talented militarily. So I don't know how this encounter is going to go, but this could be Antony's moment to shine.
Really, it was more like 4 to 1. Cicero urgently wrote to Brutus, who was currently in Greece, urging him to bring all available legions to Decimus's aid. Brutus was kind of baffled by this. Had they all lost their minds? Had they really thrown in their lot with the son of Caesar? If the Caesarian faction was fighting amongst themselves, that was good. Just sit back and wait for the dust to settle. Well,
Brutus is honestly making a good point. You know, he's saying, wait a minute, everyone take a step back. I know we've all gotten very caught up in the whole Antony versus Octavian thing, but don't we remember, these guys are all Caesarians. We want them to fight each other. And I think, honestly, that's fair. That is a fair assessment of the situation. Though, of course, it's worth noting that Brutus can probably afford to take that step back. He's further from the city, versus Cicero is in Rome, seeing everything play out. He's involved in the day-to-day politics. So their different responses do make sense based on their different perspectives. But I do think it's a fairly good point from Brutus.
What were they thinking? Brutus was horribly out of touch with how quickly things were changing in Rome.
That's true. And that is the point I made, that he's very far away, and Cicero is there seeing the day-to-day. So he is out of touch, but I to be honest, I do think there is something there. Maybe he's wrong not to use this opportunity to take down Antony, but there is a point to be made that, hey, we shouldn't all jump on the Octavian train that quickly. Let's be a little more cautious.
Whether he meant it or not, he had just stabbed Decimus in the back.
Oh.
In Cisalpine Gaul, Antony demanded Decimus's surrender. Decimus refused. Within a matter of days, Cicero worked his magic in the Senate and passed two pivotal pieces of legislation. First, he got Octavian appointed pro-praetor, which meant that he had the right to command an army while still being accountable to the consuls. It legitimized his illegal actions up to this point. Second, all governors, including Decimus, were to keep their current provinces for the foreseeable future. Anybody trying to take away anybody else's province for any reason would be in violation of the law. Cicero and the Senate sent a stern letter to Antony, instructing him to stand down. He refused. At the beginning of the new year, Antony's term as consul expired, and two new consuls took office, former Caesarians, who were now loyal to Cicero. The two new
Once again, I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but we can see we are clearly moving beyond the bounds of Caesar's influence. We are very clearly entering into a new era of Roman politics where the past alliances are all muddled. The Caesarian faction is basically no more. It has been effectively split. Like I said earlier, now it's really clear that we have a faction led by Antony, we have a faction led by Octavian, and I guess we have another faction led by Cicero, and we also have the conspirators. But at the moment, Cicero, Octavian, and at least Decimus are sort of in alliance. We've got a complicated political picture, but it has changed a lot from where we were, right at the death of Caesar.
consuls took command of 4 legions and joined up with Octavian in central Italy. Together, they all marched north to Decimus's aid. Cicero instructed one of the consuls to assume overall command, and the other to split off and raise additional legions. The consuls followed Cicero's orders, which tells you a lot. Decimus didn't mess around, and quickly moved to occupy the city of Mutina. He mobilized the entire population in preparation for a siege, and before too long, he had several years of food in storage. And
once again, and in this way, I think he's a little similar to Antony. We've seen that Decimus may not be the most politically skilled, but militarily, yeah, he's got it. So we've got a couple of pretty impressive military men going at it here. And also the fact that Cicero has so much power, it shows that his idea that he could stay in Rome and control the situation, build his own base of power, was actually correct. That is what he's managed to do with the help of Octavian.
Was training a new legion made up of locals. This was a smart strategic move. Antony was way out on a limb, and Decimus had Cicero and the Senate on his side. All he had to do was drag things out until friendly legions arrived.
True.
Antony must have finally realized that he was in a sticky situation, because his next move was to send a peace offer to Cicero. He would withdraw from Cisalpine Gaul, he said, if the Senate would agree to grant him the province of Transalpine Gaul, which was all the territory north of here. Basically all of Caesar's conquests from the Gallic Wars. Obviously, Cicero said no. The 1-year anniversary of Caesar's assassination came and went with very little fanfare. In April,
I think, though, by the way, that does show us that just another piece of evidence to add to the idea that we're sort of moving past Caesar. And on the idea of making a deal with Antony, what I will say is I think any deal with Antony right now is basically just pushing civil war further into the future, kicking the can down the road. I think if you have Antony around at all, you have very high risk of a civil war happening.
Octavian and one of the consuls arrived in Cisalpine Gaul. They outnumbered Antony 7 legions to 4, but since many of their legions were new and inexperienced, and Antony's were not, they judged that the two sides were basically equally matched. They decided to wait for the other consul to show up with 4 additional legions. But Antony surprised everybody for a second time. he abandoned the siege of Mutina and marched south, back
Wow.
around Octavian and the one consul. And
Hey, Antony's time to shine. That's what I said. We're seeing some pretty impressive moves from Antony.
set up between the two armies. Antony set an ambush and tricked the consul to the south into attacking through some wetlands. The fighting was exhausting, but by the end of the day, Antony's legions had stormed the enemy camp. The consul was killed in the fighting.
Oh, wow.
Octavian and the other consul sent help, but they
I mean, big W for Antony. Second off, now we've had the murder of a consul. Of course, this was already a code red, serious situation, but it's ramped up even further.
arrived too late. There was another minor clash, but Antony and his exhausted legions withdrew back to the north. Octavian and the only remaining consul decided not to delay any longer. They marched to relieve the siege of Mutina.
Okay.
Antony's exhausted legions put up a fight, but when Decimus opened the city gates and attacked from the other direction, he was forced to retreat. This battle happened on Decimus's birthday, which is not important, but it is funny.
Well, that's nice.
Happy birthday.
Hooray.
Happy birthday.
Speaking of our collective unceasing march toward death, that other consul died during the battle. That
Oh,
means
man.
that both
We are consul-less.
Roman consuls had died in battle, something that had not happened in 2 centuries, not since the Punic Wars.
Jesus.
With news of the victory, Cicero had the Senate name Antony an enemy of the people.
Ooh.
Can we just pause for a moment to appreciate what Cicero had accomplished here? A year ago, it
Oh, I'm willing to pause and appreciate Cicero at any moment.
looked like Antony was about to become a second Caesar. Instead, Cicero implemented a political strategy that split the Caesarian faction and ended with Antony being declared an enemy of the Republic. What an achievement.
Yeah, very impressive. And, I mean, this is what I really love about Historia Civilis' videos. You can probably tell because I've had so much to say this episode. I mean, I enjoy military history, don't get me wrong. I enjoy all kinds of history. But political history, that's really my jam. I love this kind of politicking, the interplay of different factions, you know, these behind-the-door deals, all this kind of stuff. I just love it. It's fascinating and very entertaining to me. So this is the kind of stuff I love to see in Historia Civilis videos because he does it so well. Yeah, so I just thought I'd say that. I love this kind of stuff.
Antony retreated north across the Alps and joined up with Lepidus. Decimus followed close behind. Meanwhile, Brutus was in Greece. Through diplomacy, he had used this time to gather the support of all of the provincial governors from Illyricum to Syria. This was all highly illegal, of course, but Cicero eventually secured for him an actual command, which gave the whole thing some legitimacy.
Okay.
Through this process, Brutus captured Antony's brother, Gaius Antonius.
All right, so hey, Brutus had some shortcomings initially about working with Octavian, and like I said, I do think there's a bit of truth to that, though maybe it wasn't the right time, I recognize now. But Brutus has gotten his act together, and he's working with the other conspirators, Cicero and Octavian, to fight back against Antony.
Cassius was still in Syria, in command of 8 legions. Some clever thinking allowed him to intercept a Roman army headed from Egypt to Italy, bringing his total up to 12 legions.
Wow.
Cassius pressed Brutus to go on the attack, but Brutus remained cautious. He argued that since they had broad support across the empire, there was no need to force one decisive battle. Much better to just let the Caesarians bleed each other dry. I do my best to be generous to these historical figures who were acting with imperfect information, but I will point out that during this crisis, Brutus's first instinct always seemed to be do nothing. That's an alarming trait.
Yeah, I do kind of agree. Like I said, I think there was a bit of truth to what Brutus said initially, but now that the situation has sort of evolved, and Cassius has so many legions, you know, I do understand his argument to just leave it alone. We don't need to force a decisive battle, but I think at this point I would agree with Cassius far more that we've got overwhelming power. This is a dangerous situation. If we leave it, we don't know what's going to happen. Let's go in the attack. I mean, hey, that's what Julius Caesar would have done. He would have gone in the attack, And at this point, I think that's definitely the right decision to make.
I wonder how different things would have been if Cassius had been the one put in charge.
Yeah. I mean, look, I have a bit of sympathy. I am a fairly cautious individual as well, but I'm also not a leader of such importance, right? And I think if you're in this sort of position, it is important to be decisive, willing to take those big steps. And, I was a little critical of Cassius earlier for all the complaining, but at the moment, he's got the right idea, and Brutus, I think, is being held back by his caution.
By the summer of 43, Octavian began to complain to Cicero about the empty consulships. He said that it was impossible to prosecute a war without leadership at the top. He said that, wait for it, he should be named a replacement consul.
Yep.
It's not actually clear that this was necessary at all. Elections were already ramping up for next year.
And this is where I just gave Brutus some fair criticism, but I'll bring it back around to his point that at the very least we should be careful working with Octavian, which I do agree with, as we're seeing, even though this is probably the right move for Cicero and the conspirators, what you risk in teaming up with Octavian is that as Antony begins to weaken, Octavian gets more and more powerful, and he starts to grab for power on his own. Now, to be honest, in the grand scheme, asking for a consulship isn't that big of a power grab with all the context we have, but it could be the beginning of a much larger power grab.
The Senate was functioning properly, the armies in the field were winning. What was the big emergency? Cicero and the Senate denied Octavian's request.
Wow.
And then, just like that, Octavian marched on Rome.
And there you go. A sort of small power grab, when refused, immediately evolves into a much larger power grab. That's exactly what I was saying.
Again. Things are getting pretty wacky, so let's take a second to
Yeah, this
recap.
is complicated.
Decimus was attacking Antony. Cicero and the Senate were supporting Decimus and attacking Antony. Brutus and
Yes.
Cassius were supposed to be attacking Antony, but since they distrusted Octavian, they were keeping their powder dry.
Yeah.
Octavian had been attacking Antony, but now he was attacking Cicero and the Senate. It was starting to look like a five-sided civil war.
Damn.
Cicero and the
Yeah.
Senate called upon 4 legions in North Africa to defend the capital, but
Well, hey, now that frickin', Brutus and Cassius, or at least Brutus, didn't want to act because they were suspicious of Octavian, Octavian's made his move. You should come in now and help Cicero.
all 4 went over to the son of Caesar.
Oh,
Octavian
wow.
sent some centurions into the city of Rome to negotiate. According to one account, maybe embellishing a bit for dramatic effect, the lead
Probably.
centurion approached a group of senators, rested his hand on the hilt of his sword, and said, "If the Senate does not make Octavian a consul, this will."
Yikes.
The Senate called special elections, but everybody knew the results in advance. Octavian and one of his cousins were elected consuls and
course.
took office immediately. One of Octavian's first acts was to condemn Caesar's assassins, officially ending the grand compromise that was set up immediately after Caesar's assassination.
See, and now everything's beginning to fall apart. I mean, it was already falling apart with this war with Antony, but now Octavian has power, and this supposed alliance that he had with Cicero and some of the conspirators, mainly with Cicero, is also falling apart. This is when we talk about a 5-sided civil war. It's getting very complicated, and everyone's against everybody else. We've basically fallen into chaos.
If you remember, the assassins were granted amnesty in exchange for ratification of Caesar's political acts. That was all over now. Octavian had altered the deal.
Damn.
Cicero was distraught. He bitterly wrote to Decimus, telling him that, quote, "The Senate was my weapon, and it has fallen to pieces in my hand."
See, this is the thing about Cicero. And honestly, this is, I think, what makes him a really fascinating character, but this is also what sort of weakens him in a lot of these situations. I mean, at this point, he's been through a civil war, Caesar, the chaos of Caesar's assassination, and now we're entering into another civil war. And Cicero has always tried to do things politically. He's always tried to negotiate. He's not a military man. He doesn't lead armies, generally. And Cicero's done very well for himself considering that, but he keeps running into these situations where the fact that he's not a strong man with an army behind him gets him into trouble. This is one of those situations, because Cicero's trying to operate civically, politically, there's not a whole lot he can do apart from call on his allies, who are armed strongmen. If we look back on the civil war between Caesar and Pompey, what was Cicero forced to do? Choose a side. He had to choose one of the armed strongmen to side with. So, like I said, this is one of the fascinating things about Cicero, is that he always tries to negotiate and politic his way out, but he faces a lot of failures trying to do that. A lot of successes too, but a lot of failures.
He also wrote to Brutus in Greece, telling him to get to Rome as soon as humanly possible.
Yeah, now is the time.
Incredibly, Brutus refused. He
Oh
seemed
my
to believe
God.
that he and Cicero were having some minor disagreement over tactics. He was mistaken. What Cicero was
Yeah, okay. At first, I thought Brutus's caution, it was a little justified, but as we've gone on, it's become less and less justifiable, and now it seems pretty blatantly ridiculous. If you want to maintain this alliance with Cicero, and you want to fight back against Octavian, which Brutus does, or at least he says he does, you should absolutely, you and Cassius, send troops to Rome. I mean, you have a lot of damn troops.
actually saying was that he had lost the war. His attempt to split the Caesarian faction had failed.
Damn.
In defeat, Cicero left the city in Octavian's hands and retired to the Italian countryside.
And what did I say at this point much earlier in this video? We talked about how Cicero and Octavian were temporary allies because their interests aligned. They were both opposed to Antony. But as time goes on, with this complex political situation, their interests are going to diverge, and we've witnessed that happen.
As consul, Octavian opened up negotiations with Antony. In doing so, he stabbed Cicero, Decimus, Cassius, Brutus, and the entire Roman Senate in the back.
He did, but... And, you know, to be fair, I am talking with hindsight, so maybe this was harder to see at the time, but to be honest, y'all should have seen it coming. He marched on the city, you know, he's the son of Caesar, he's trying to do exactly what Antony is doing, and the temporary alliance made sense, but you should have been a little more cautious. And at first I thought that's what Brutus was urging, but now that the situation has presented itself, Brutus refuses to take up arms against Octavian, or at least to aggressively take up arms against him and march on Rome. So, you know, this seems like a bit of a failing of some of the conspirators and senators. Like I said, you know, I think with Cicero this comes down to the fact that he is not an armed strongman, and so he needs the help of other armed strongmen, who in this case have sort of let him down.
Antony and Lepidus spent all summer recruiting soldiers, and by the autumn, they re-entered Cisalpine Gaul with 18 legions.
Oh,
Decimus had no choice but to pull back. On his difficult trek back through the Alps, most of his army deserted him. His initial plan was to head east and join forces with Brutus and Cassius, but without an army, there was very little point in doing that. Instead, he decided to head north. Decimus had spent the better part of a decade campaigning with Caesar in Gaul. He had plenty of allies up there, he was fluent in the language, perhaps he could pull some strings and raise an army. But
Okay.
apparently when Decimus reached the Rhine River, everybody, including his bodyguards, abandoned him. Without protection, it wasn't safe for Decimus to be in Gaul, and so he
Damn.
changed plans once more, disguised himself as a local, and started making his way east to Brutus. But
What a remarkable sort of drop in authority. I mean, this is a man who was not that long ago one of the most powerful players in Roman politics, you know, leading an army, fighting against Antony. Now he's been abandoned by everybody as he tries to sneak around Roman territory disguised.
Decimus's string of bad luck would not end. While going through a totally routine checkpoint in Cisalpine Gaul, a Roman soldier recognized his face. Decimus was captured, and Antony demanded his head.
That is
Within a few
unlucky.
days, he got it.
Damn. Wow.
Late in the year, Octavian, Antony, and Lepidus met near the border of Cisalpine Gaul and Italy to negotiate a deal.
I mean, after everything we've gone through, we've literally circled back to the Caesarians. We started this whole thing with the murder of Caesar and all the controversy with Antony and Lepidus versus the Senate. Cicero managed to gain power, allies himself with Octavian, the conspirators, all of that. And it's right back to Caesar's men. I talk about how, to some extent, we've moved past the influence of Caesar, and that is true. New alliances are being forged. But in other ways, the legacy of Caesar is still extremely influential. And we can see that here.
This deal would become known to historians as the Second Triumvirate. Unlike the First Triumvirate between Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus, this was official, backed up with the full force of law.
Man, triumvirates seem to always collapse into civil war, huh? Maybe they shouldn't have done another one, after looking back at the last one, which of course collapsed into Caesar versus Pompey.
All three triumvirs would be awarded dictatorial power for 5 years. In addition to this, each would be responsible for governing a portion of the western half of Rome's empire. Remember, Brutus and Cassius still controlled the east. Antony would control Gaul, which is exactly what he had wanted since the beginning.
It's interesting, we have this split power situation with these men with dictatorial powers, basically several dictators ruling over different territories. This is what will become very common in Roman history hundreds of years later, as we have, emperors becoming emperors of the East and the West, and emperors of different regions. But before we get to that, we have hundreds of years of one guy at the top. It's just sort of funny that we're seeing this sort of split of authority at the moment, and then we have such a long period where that is not the norm, and then, at the end of the West, sort of at the end of Roman history, we return to this situation of having several different men in this top position of authority.
Lepidus would control Spain. Octavian would control North Africa and the Mediterranean islands like Sicily and Sardinia.
Seems like Octavian got the short straw, you know what I mean? I feel like Octavian has pretty bad territory compared to Antony and Lepidus.
You can tell from this agreement that Octavian was the junior partner here.
Yeah. Antony gets, Gaul, Cisalpine Gaul. These are very important, powerful territories. Lepidus gets Spain, once again, important, powerful territory. And Octavian gets North Africa and a couple of islands. Maybe not a great end of the deal, but once again, we saw that how it came to this was that Antony and Lepidus gathered up a bunch of troops and probably would have squished Octavian if he hadn't entered into negotiations.
The triumvirate also gave the three the ability to make law without consulting the Senate or the people of Rome.
Wow.
This is, frankly, what Cicero had feared all along. Unchecked authoritarian power. A Roman monarchy with 3 heads. Antony, Lepidus, and Octavian then ordered a purge of Rome's political class. The Romans called these proscriptions.
These 3 are willing to take the brutal actions that the conspirators weren't willing to take. And this is why these guys have come out on top, and the conspirators are in a lot of trouble. They still have a chance. Brutus and Cassius still hold a lot of territory and a lot of troops, but the conspirators decided they didn't want to do a purge. They didn't want to murder Antony and Lepidus and Octavian, who was Octavius at the time. They just wanted to get rid of Caesar. They didn't want to seize power. And look where it ended up. The brutality is certainly not nice. I'm not claiming that. It's not good. You want to see as few deaths as possible. But if you have a political goal, in a political situation like this, a climate like this of violence and chaos, man, sometimes you have to be brutal to achieve your goals. And that's kind of what we've seen for years now. Julius Caesar was a good example of someone who was merciful when he needed to be, but was pretty brutal when he thought it would serve him, right? And clearly Antony, Lepidus, and Octavian were taking notes, and the conspirators, partially because they didn't want to be authoritarians, weren't willing to do that, and it sort of contributed to their loss.
This was not without precedent. The dictator Sulla had ordered large proscriptions 40 years earlier, but this was regarded as a traumatic event, not only to Rome's political class, but to Caesar personally, who was careful to avoid doing the same thing when he came to power.
Yeah.
But Antony, Lepidus, and Octavian were young, and had no memory of Sulla's purge. They didn't care.
Antony, Lepidus, Octavian took notes on what Caesar did and ramped it up. Though Caesar was becoming pretty authoritarian by the end. His ego was getting to his head, but Caesar always tried to be a little more merciful, because that's what the situation called for. These three are taking a different route. And like I said, the brutality isn't nice, and there's a spectrum of, being completely peaceful, and then just abhorrent random violence. I'm not saying the conspirators should have gone all the way to the other side, but once again, a little bit of brutality purging some of the top Caesarians probably would have worked in their favor.
Their enemies had to go. The way prescriptions worked is that every day a list would be posted in a public place with the names of those that had been prescribed. Anybody on the list was instantly stripped of their citizenship and was no longer under the protection of Roman law. Any citizen who ratted out or murdered a prescribed person was entitled to seize a portion of their wealth with...
Man, this is a very chaotic way to go about political purges, huh? I mean, I guess I'm more used to the modern way of doing things, which is you send out the secret police and just execute the people. This is grassroots, ground up political assassination. Sorry, not to make too much of a joke out of it. It is serious and pretty sad, but it's a little shocking, like how they're going about this. I mean, it's not just them. They mentioned that prescription was done in the past, but it's a curious system.
The rest going to the state. The prescriptions were truly a repugnant practice. They turned a whole generation of murderers into millionaires. Of course, many fled.
Seems like a bad incentive structure.
As soon as their names appeared on the prescription lists. But the
Rightfully
promise
so.
of wealth completely destroyed friendships and tore families apart. It was horrible.
Damn.
As much as a third of the Roman Senate was prescribed, as well as thousands of other rich citizens.
Yeah, man. I mean, look, no sort of political assassination or political purge is good, morally good in any way. But, I mean, with, using, say, a secret police force, at least you're not incentivizing ordinary Roman citizens to get their hands dirty and turn themselves into murderers in order to get rich. It seems like this system has consequences beyond just the murders, which are bad enough. You're really corrupting a lot of people, and I would say probably creating quite the atmosphere of, fear, panic, chaos. Seems like a really, really terrible and brutal system.
In fact, the historian Appian writes that some were prescribed simply because they were rich. That's bad, I think. No, yeah, that's bad. Murder's bad. We're
Yeah,
anti-murder in this house.
I agree. Murder is bad. Just, I feel like I don't have to clarify that, but in case any of y'all were wondering, I am also anti-murder.
There was an ongoing negotiation between Antony, Lepidus, and Octavian as to who would appear on the prescription lists. In the end, they were all forced to compromise and give up people who they would have preferred to save.
Jesus.
Antony gave up his uncle. Lepidus gave up his brother. Octavian gave up Cicero, the man that he had once called father. Antony was the one who insisted.
I mean, it's horrible. It's it's a tragic situation. And you think, once again, it's a complicated situation. Like I said, there is a spectrum of violence. And as I just said, no purges, no political murders are morally good. But I can't help but think that this would have been prevented if the conspirators were willing to take more drastic action either upon the murder of Caesar, after the murder of Caesar, or even when Brutus and Cassius got the opportunity to march against Antony or against Octavian. I mean, if they had taken more action, taken an authoritarian power grab or a more violent or brutal action, it does seem like this, which is just horrific, could have been prevented. But, you know, that is kind of how history works. We don't exactly know what would have happened. There's a lot of what ifs. It's a complex situation.
On December 7th, 43 BCE, a small group, led by a military tribune and a centurion, showed up at Cicero's villa. The doors were locked, but they busted in. After interrogating some workers, they learned that Cicero was on his way to the sea. They caught up with him on the road. He knew that he was caught. He told his entourage to stop. They found him in a reclined position, reading. He spoke to his killers. "I am stopping here." He turned to the lead centurion. "Come here, soldier. There's nothing proper about what you're doing, but at least make sure you cut off my head properly."
I mean, look, Cicero's a complicated guy, like everybody else. There's good parts to him and there's bad parts. You can like him or you can not like him. But one, you can't deny how influential he was, how powerful he was at times. And two, this is exactly the way I would expect him to go in this circumstance. You know, he's not really one to die fleeing or to die panicked. He wants to die with dignity. You know, this is exactly what I would expect him to do. This is very Cicero-esque. So, it's unfortunate it has to happen, but at least he's not disappointing in his final moments.
Cicero stuck out his neck and indicated what he wanted done. The
Jesus.
centurion slit his throat. The group of killers then cut the head and the hands off of Cicero's body and sent them to Antony as proof. Antony nailed Cicero's hands to the speaking platform outside the Senate House, the same hands that wrote all those pamphlets opposing him 1 year ago.
Yeah, I'm certain that's exactly why Antony did it. Yeah, as we can see, this is a whole nother level of brutality than even what Caesar did, right? And to be fair, Caesar was always more merciful to Roman citizens than he was to Gauls. You know, the Gauls would like to have a word right now, burning down towns and, you know, brutal massacres. Totally fair, I recognize that. But in terms of Caesar's treatment of his own people, do we remember what happened when Pompey was murdered? Caesar was not happy about that. Whether he was posturing or he was being genuine, that was not a moment of celebration for Caesar. He was quite upset. Fast forward to, you know, the inheritors of Caesar's legacy, Octavian, Antony, and Lepidus, and Antony is reveling in the murder of Cicero. It's a different time. Things have been going bad in Roman politics for a while. A lot of chaos, a lot of violence. Seems like they're getting, somehow, remarkably, even worse.
It is so upsetting that Cicero went out this way. He deserved better.
Yeah,
Historian Anthony Everett calls him the greatest statesman in Roman history.
I'm no expert on Roman history, but from what I know, that very well could be true. I mean, the late Republican era is my favorite period of Roman history. That's one of the reasons I like Cicero so much, but I think that could very well be a deserved title. I mean, I think you could call Cicero one of the greatest statesmen in world history ever. He's up there with the best of the best.
I love Cicero. I'm in that camp too.
Yeah, I recognize Cicero's a complicated guy, and I know some of you don't like him as much, but I'm definitely in the pro-Cicero camp. I do like Cicero.
Years later, when Octavian was an old man, he caught his grandson reading something that Cicero had written. His grandson had some vague notion that this was some old enemy of his grandfather's, and so in a panic, he tried to hide the writing under his clothes. Octavian saw what he was trying to do and had him hand it over. For a long time, he stood there, reading the words of Cicero, written in another era. In time, he handed the writing back to his grandson, saying, "My child, this was a learned man and a lover of his country."
Oh, it's kind of sad. Oh man, that makes me sad that Cicero went that way. You know, Octavian liked Cicero, right? Think back on Caesar. Caesar and Cicero were great enemies at many points. Cicero was not a fan of Caesar upon his rise. Cicero sided with the Pompeians. Cicero opposed Caesar's authoritarian actions. They were political foes more often than not. But it does seem like they maintained a good or at least cordial relationship throughout that. I think Caesar did respect Cicero. Octavian respected Cicero. A lot of people did, regardless of what side of the political divide they were on. A lot of people liked the guy. A lot of people respected him. Cicero could work with both sides at once, while I would say still staying true to his mission. Cicero valued practicality over principle. And I agree with him on that, honestly. I think you have to get things done. If you're not willing to compromise, then you're never going to achieve anything. But, I don't think Cicero ever abandoned his principles. He was definitely a hypocrite in some areas, and I'm willing to point that out. But I do think Cicero was always striving to return back to the good old days of the Republic as best he could. And he did what he could to do that. So yeah, Cicero's a fascinating guy. I like him a lot. I'm a big Cicero fan. This was a fantastic episode. I particularly like this one, the focus on Cicero. Like I mentioned earlier, I love the political drama. This is like my favorite thing, honestly. I love a lot of types of history. I have a particular focus on political, intellectual, and social history, but I just love these political shakeups, the negotiations. It's very much up my alley. This was a great one. If you guys enjoyed this one, I'd appreciate it if you would leave a like, comment, subscribe. Check out the Patreon or channel memberships for exclusive reaction content, including Historia Civilis reactions. I hope you guys are all having a good day today, and I will see you all again next time. Goodbye.